First thing to say about it, if you looked at the posters, there's a fantastic misprint on the posters. It says winner, Philip Seymour Hoffman, winner of the Golden Globe Award, Best Actor, brackets, musical or comedy. Believe me, if you go and see Capote waiting for either the gags or the songs to start, you're going to be sorely disappointed. He didn't win in the musical comedy category. He won in the dramatic category, you dimwits. So it's neither a musical nor a comedy. It is an anti-biopic of the extremely annoying Truman Capote. If you don't know, but I imagine most people do, Truman Capote was a journalist, and he went in 1959 to cover a murder in Kansas in which a family had been killed completely senselessly as far as anyone could tell. Very swiftly, they caught the killers. Truman Capote then decided that he was going to write a non-fiction novel about the killing. And he then developed a relationship with the killers, which was very peculiar in that he kind of sort of fell in love with one of them virtually. And then as the case went on and as the appeals went on and as they kept not getting executed, became more and more frustrated by the fact that he couldn't finish his book until their story finished. And it's a classic case of a journalist inveigling himself into people's confidences for reasons which are far from pure. His performance is brilliant, and I'm pretty certain that he will win the Oscar for Best Actor, and deservedly so. I mean, he's completely reshaped himself to do it, because Capote was a fairly slight man, and I think his performance is really terrific. But what's fantastic about Capote is that it's as if Philip Seymour Hoffman has completely immersed himself in the character of Capote. But the movie is made by people who seem to be completely alienated from Capote, by Bennett Miller, the director, and Dan Futterman, the screenwriter. Now, when I first saw it, the thing that I was immediately reminded of was there's a very famous article by Janet Malcolm called The Journalist and the Murderer. And she wrote this article about, to cut a very long story short, a guy was convicted of murder. An American journalist inveigled his way into his confidence whilst the trial was on, said, I'm going to write your story. And what he actually did was he thought the guy that he was writing the story of was guilty. When the guy was found guilty, this bloke then wrote a book saying, I always knew he was guilty, he was terribly guilty. The murderer then sued the journalist for saying, well, I may be a convicted killer, but you're libelling, you're bad-mouthing me. That journalist then went to Janet Malcolm and said, oh, it's terrible, I'm being done the dirty on by this murderer who's suing me. Janet Malcolm then wrote a piece about that journalist saying, actually, the journalist is wrong. The point of the article was, what Janet Malcolm said was never trust a journalist, never trust a journalist's relationship with their subject, because in the end, all they're interested in is themselves. Now, when I saw Capote, that was what was in my mind. I was thrilled a little later on to read an interview with Dan Futterman in which he himself cited Janet Malcolm's The Journalist and the Murderer. And if you haven't read The Journalist and the Murderer, go and read it. It's only about 100 pages long. It's an absolutely blistering essay on the relationship between journalism and true crime novel writing. And now, I am particularly interested in this subject. So from 5 minutes into the film, I was just there. I thought, how terrific to see a movie which is not a biopic that loves its subject. It's a biopic that has a distance from its subject. Actually, the subject isn't the centre of the film. It's not really about Capote. It's really about this terrible relationship in which a journalist would effectively lie to somebody. There's a marvellous moment when one of the criminals is in jail, and he says to Capote, what are you going to call the book? And Capote says, well, I haven't decided what I'm going to call it. I haven't thought of a title. And he's already decided he's going to call it In Cold Blood. Then, when they keep getting stays of execution, we see Capote getting really, really bothered because I can't finish my book until it's almost like he no longer has any morality left. And of course, the sucker punch of the story is that after the killers were executed, and if you've seen the film, the Richard Brooks film of In Cold Blood, you'll know the story of that. And that's, incidentally, a very interesting film. It was all filmed in the actual locations, right down to the Clutter house where the original murders happened. Capote never finished another substantial work afterwards. It was almost like doing In Cold Blood finished him off as well. So
even though he lived for quite a long time.
No, he lived, and he was a celebrated New York socialite, and he was a celebrated, but he never finished another great work. It was like that was the work that he had in him. And I think the real triumph of Capote the movie is that it manages to get right inside its central subject, but also to stand back, to be completely objective about what he did, about his methods. It doesn't paint him as a complete villain, but what it does is it takes a really interesting look at the way in which journalism is essentially duplicitous in this area. It has a fantastic supporting performance from Catherine Keener, who is in almost everything she's in, she's flawless. And in this, it's another understated role as Harper Lee. You know, she goes off and she writes To Kill a Mockingbird whilst Capote is doing this. She writes To Kill a Mockingbird. It's published. It comes out as a film. But Capote doesn't see any of it because all he sees is his own pain and the fact that he can't get his book finished. And all through it, Philip Seymour Hoffman never makes you want to do the thing which me just doing that for 10 seconds makes you want to do, which is to go, I'm sorry, I can't stand this anymore. If you do that again, I'm going to slap you. So I really think it's something. Obviously, I have a particular interest in this subject because my PhD was on horror fiction, and one whole section on it was about true crime novels, everything from In Cold Blood through the Moors Murders books, Beyond Belief, and on to Gordon Burns, Somebody's Husband, Somebody's Son. So this is a subject that I'm very interested in. And if you are interested in that and the duplicitousness of journalism, you will sit there watching Capote thinking, this is like being in a university lecture, only fun. But if you're not interested in that stuff, and I think a lot of people will just go for this, just go for that barnstorming central performance, honestly, there's much more going on in it than that. I know that his performance is the thing which is dominating the reviews, but there is so much more substance. And hats off to Bennett Miller and Dan Futterman for pulling it off, because they've done a bravura job. And when you've seen the movie and when you've enjoyed it, go and get Janet Malcolm's The Journalist and the Murderer and read it.
So never trust a journalist,
no,
unless he's played by George Clooney, which is
exactly, which is a complete,
a slightly different take on what journalism does or could do.
What Malcolm was specifically saying was, it's journalists reporting interviews. Okay, a journalist talking to you is one thing, but a journalist interviewing you, I mean, this must have happened to you. You've been interviewed by a journalist, and the journalist has then written up the interview, and what you read isn't, I mean, it's kind of what you said, but it's not quite what you said.
Print journalists can always put their spin on something, hence the advantage of doing them here, where people hear exactly what people are saying.
The great joy of live radio is that it's impossible to do that. In print journalism, and this is what Janet Malcolm is saying in The Journalist and the Murderer, and of course she herself has been accused of doing it, and this is what happened with Capote. It's, in the end, it's their story that they're telling. And that's the central heart of Capote. I know it sounds esoteric. I know it sounds, hyper highfalutin and intellectual, the rest of it. It really isn't. The brilliance of the film is that you almost don't notice the depths of the subjects that it's addressing.